Hi, everyone. This is Peony from the Alliance Française. We're a French language and cultural center based on SB Road, which is not too far from here. And part of our mission is to promote French culture and to promote collaborations between French artists and Indian artists. And by art, we also mean different domains, such as literature. I am joined today by Fabien Chartier. He is a professor. He teaches English at the University of Rennes. He is also a scholar, an expert on Rabindranath Tagore. And as was mentioned by our lovely anchor, thank you so much, he has written and annotated this masterpiece on Tagore. As was also mentioned earlier, Fabien was a student at St. Stephen's, was a professor at St. Stephen's University in Delhi, and he used to teach French at that point of time. And if I'm not mistaken, Fabien, you discovered Tagore when you were a student.
Exactly.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you discovered him and how you were inspired to write about him?
Okay, thank you very much, Peony. This is an history on its own, because I just happened to be in Delhi for my studies when I was studying in MA, and I just went to a bookshop and I saw the front cover of the Gitanjali by Rabindranath Tagore, and I felt that this was the author I would like to work on and study on for maybe 1 year, because this is how it works for the master's degree. And then I felt that this required another maybe 3 years, which was a PhD thesis, and it went on and on like this. But it was more than this aspect, which is more like the normal student life. There is the emotional part of it, which is like I wanted to continue because I felt it was something important for me. I was just following someone whose work and even life was really important in the sense that it changed India, but also part of the world. Maybe you don't know all about this, but his importance, his impact was worldwide at a particular moment. And because I did not know Bengali, I felt it was more interesting for me and more, justified to focus on these aspects, which are his life, rather than really the analysis of his work, though I've been doing both, but mostly I paid attention to what was his meetings with intellectuals, for example, but also the reception of the average people in France and in Great Britain. That's how it started.
Thanks for that, Fabien. And speaking of Rabindranath Tagore's reception in France, I think the audience here, you are aware of Tagore. Yes, of course. But we're not necessarily aware of how Tagore may be perceived in a country like France. Could you tell us a little bit about how his work was perceived? I understand that there's a universality to it. Was this something that resonated with the French people? What's your take on that?
Thank you. Okay, so let's travel to 1912. Okay, Tagore went to London with a volume of a collection of poems which he had translated himself, which will be known as the Gitanjali, Song Offerings of Gitanjali. So this was 103 poems altogether, and he presented this collection of poems to very important people in London at the time, including W.B. Yeats. Maybe some of you know that person, very famous poet, Irish poet. And he also presented that collection to people like Ezra Pound, who's another famous poet. Well, the list is very long. So, but at the time, there were also French people in London, because London was the place to be. Okay, sometimes it's Paris, sometimes it's London. Okay, it's like this. That's the reason why we love so much each other. No, it's kidding, because there has been always a rivalry between England and France. So at that time it was more London, just before Great War. Okay, we are in 1912, and this is quite important. So in 1912, you have Tagore introduced in the little parlor salon of the Great London area, Kensington and all this. And then you've got some poets, French poets, who are present also in London. And one of them, who happens, his name is not famous to you, he's more famous to the French literary circles, even today. That's someone called Saint-John Perse. He will be a Nobel Prize in 1960. So that gives you an idea of how important he is, or he was at the time. At the time he was already famous, though he was only 24. So Saint-John Perse discovers these 103 poems. In fact, he goes to the editor, which is a very small edition at the time. India Society it's called. So you can see that it's really a manuscript. From a manuscript, you've got a little edition of, let's say, 100 copies, and that's it. He takes one of those, and he shows the document to another very famous person, who is known in France as André Gide, who will be also a Nobel Prize. Okay, so you see, you've got like 3 Nobel Prizes, future ones, who are working hands in hands for the translation of what will be the French Gitanjali, known as l'offrande lyrique. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is how, historically, the Gitanjali was discovered and then transmitted and then translated by someone very famous at that time already. Okay, and what is more is that this person I'm talking about, this translator, André Gide, was a writer but also an editor and a publisher. He was selecting the main authors, or the authors who were writing in English and deserved to be translated. And he was then the head, we could say that, of the NRF, and basically this is Gallimard. And what is this? Is also a Gallimard book. Gallimard is probably among the 3 or 4 major publishing houses in France. So that gives you an idea of how important it was at the time, and it still is, because in a way, most of the works of Tagore were published by this famous publisher. So that's how it started, and but there was the war that came very soon. So first, Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1913. Okay, just 1 year after this. It was really a surprise. Okay, except in these literary circles, nobody had any idea who Tagore was. So it was a revelation, several meanings of the term. And then in 1914, war starts. So everything is more complicated. It's a bit like pandemic. You see, everything is like a status quo for 4 years, including edition. And authors, so I'm talking about Gide, for example, he's depressed. Okay, so some writers during the pandemic, they were pretty low as well. Others, they felt, oh, that's cool, I have time to write, and others will be more depressed. Okay, well, Gide was more depressed at the time. So he spent some time on translation, but he also spent some time on, we say, brewing black ideas, like it was very dark and solitary work. And so he was not anymore, after his translation, in the spirit of Tagore. So he left Tagore's side for a while, and though he went back to it, because he also translated a very famous play of Tagore, which is The Post Office. I don't know if you know it. You know, it's the story of Amal, the little child, okay, who is indicating to the adults how they should behave well, not how they should behave, because he's not moralizing at all, because Tagore never moralizes. He just gives ideas and you do whatever you want with them. So he's giving ideas like this to the adults, and the adults are more or less responsive. So Gide translates this one, and then he doesn't translate Tagore any longer, so you've got other translators, and a lot of translators, like it's not 2, 3, 4, it's like 12 translators, 12 different translators, and most of them, they translated Tagore from English to French, not from Bengali to French. So even in this book, for example, most of the texts, whether they are poems, novels, short stories, essays, they're mostly translations from the English to French. There are a few exceptions though, but that's it. And for novels such as, for example, the famous Gora is famous for being kind of nationalist novel or non-violent novel, because at the end you've got a twist, very important twist. Well, Gora, you had to wait 1961 to have a translation in French. So of course Tagore was dead in 1941. So he would have been 100 years ago, 100 years old. Sorry, what's end of the day. So yeah. So you see some translations, they went very quick, and others very slowly. Most of the translations which were translated quickly, they were mystic poems. So Tagore, first, he became famous as a mystic poet, not as a political man or social or an educator, activist or whatever. He was more considered as a mystic poet. That's how it went on, and he remained more like a mystic poet in France, and all his novels, like Gaire Bare, or The Home and the World, is not that famous, or were not that famous until Satyajit Ray, for example, shot a movie, and then, of course, because of cinema, it changed a little, and Tagore's benefited from Satyajit Ray's movies, as Satyajit himself benefited from Tagore, since he was a student in Shantiniketan and really infused with the spirit of Shantiniketan. So that's it.
Thank you, Fabien. Since we were talking about translation, I have one question to ask you about this. And of course, we will also open up the floor to questions from the audience. We would like to hear from you, and we would like this to be an interaction between you and the author themselves. So I believe Tagore himself had translated a series of his work from Bengali to English, and then I think other people translated it from Bengali to English, and then again there were translations from English to French. What is the difference to you between the translations that came from Tagore and the translations that came from more contemporary writers who read the work and sort of contextualized it to modern day?
Okay, well, as you said, some of the works of Tagore were translated by himself, and these are really accurate in the sense, well, they are like stamped by the Tagore clan, you know. These are, okay, Tagore did the translation himself, so there is no problem about that. Whether or not the translation is perfect, I mean, That's like a recreation of his own work. Sometimes, well, maybe Tagore did not translate himself so well on the opinion of other scholars, but it doesn't matter. You know, you're not going to talk too much on this. But other people started translating Tagore from Bengali to English, and as soon as it happened, there was a problem. Because, for example, you've got a collection of poems. In Bengali, they say, "Well, this is not Tagore. This is in English. It doesn't sound Tagorean at all. So they are not worth it. You've got to go back to the Bengali to understand or to have to the essence of it." Whatever. This is the whole problem of translation. Some translations they are okay. Some other are maybe less less valid. It's really difficult to say because it's very subjective, right? But the thing is that what we have in France at that time was the English version. So there was no other choice but to translate from the English version. So maybe there is a lost in translation, first from Bengali to English and then from English to French. That's a possibility. And that has been relevant throughout maybe 1 century. Because recently we have had a few translations from Bengali to French of Tagore's works, but these are mostly unpublished works. So you cannot really compare them. Okay? So it's like there are very, very few translators from Bengali to French. It's an open door here maybe. But it's something pretty new, and the translators, they focused on unpublished works by Tagore or other Bengali authors, which is a good thing, I think, because there is not only Tagore, but Tagore, the Bengali literature is quite rich, actually. So that was the choice, but my opinion here is that Tagore deserves to be retranslated or translated again to give a more dynamic perspective, something which would appeal the younger generation more, because just the same way as Tagore, some people will tell you cannot touch Tagore's work. People in France would say you cannot modify Gide's translation, because Gide is a giant also in France. But I disagree with this, because we need always to reconsider things. The language evolves, and also the style. And the style in Bengali, I don't think it has evolved the same way. Maybe I'm wrong, because I'm not a Bengali speaker. But this is not what has changed. The idea of Tagore hasn't changed. Okay, so the idea, the volume, the essence, and the multiple layers of understanding are still there. What has changed is the French version may sound a bit outdated. So there is a need to revitalize or rejuvenate it.
Thanks. I think it's very interesting how we can revisit the same text through different translations throughout the years. But to come to this content that was written by Tagore himself, he has explored many themes in his work. Could you tell us a little bit about the themes, the different themes that he touched upon, and what it was like for you to discover them as you were creating this book over here?
Thank you very much. In fact, it's pretty strange. I've been working on Tagore for 25 years, and I'm discovering and rediscovering the topics, the different topics and themes, but also what was inside. Because, as I said, you can understand Tagore a different way or different ways. Like you have a poem, and you just realize suddenly that no, this is not a romance story. There is something behind, which is more political or more social, and it depends really on your mood as well. and you suddenly, but did I read this already? Couldn't I see this? So it depends on how you are. So the main topics depends also on how you have a look at the author at the very moment that you're reading the text. It's the same also with optimism and pessimism. You may feel that some passages in Tagore are really depressive. In fact, often they're not, because next page he will guide you to something which is totally positive. Tagore is extremely positive, in fact. You've got to consider this, because he himself has experienced a life that could lead to various depressions. I mean, it's a family life which is you wouldn't hope for your worst enemy. Okay, that's it. And yet, at the end of it, he is optimistic. And so that's the first thing. Keep optimism, whatever happens. Then there is this universality. We call it universal humanism. Okay, we belong to the same planet and we are here to protect it. So, today ecofeminism is very trendy. Well, I think we've got here someone who is like a proto-ecofeminist, because some of the subjects, like defense of women and defense of the environment, are two priorities. So, of course, the name was not born yet it was very close. When we think about India and all the actions by women protecting their environment, like lying themselves to trees to protect the trees, for primitive forest and all this, we've got something which is typically Indian in a way, particularly human. Okay, we've got to think about it today even more than before, and for this reason we have to consider that he was a pioneer, definitely. Then there is this mysticism. Okay, mysticism, this is like something individual, but I consider it's Atma and Brahma. That's like he's touching different Atmas and saying, okay, take it the way you want, but we live in that global environment and we're sharing the same space, so we've got to be sharing it positively, but that's your own work. It's like electrons, like you're doing whatever you want, but you've got to respect each other. And so there is this unity and diversity which is always here. So these are some of the topics which I believe are the most important with education, and that would be the last one. You remember that he was sometimes in conflicts with Mahatma Gandhi, because Gandhi would say, okay, we need to reach that independence through ahimsa, of course, non-violence and all this. But Tagore used to say to Gandhi, because sometimes he disagreed, okay, we need to go independent, no problem, from the British, but sometimes the end doesn't justify the means. So before doing things, you need education for people so that they can by themselves know what they're doing and why they're doing it. Otherwise, we will become independent, but we can be guided by somebody else who might not have that wisdom and who could lead us to something wrong. So this was extremely political, and this again I'm not going to interpret. I will stop here. But yes, it's a way of saying beware, and that's the reason why Gandhi said he was the great sentinel of India. Okay, I don't like the word Gurudev. Okay, to define Tagore, I would say he is the sentinel of India. And Tagore said, Gandhi, you are the Mahatma. So they gave each other this nickname. Remember this, Mahatma was not Mahatma before Tagore gave that name to Gandhi. It's like two great men.
Okay, we've just run out of time. Anyways, we can just have a couple of quick questions, if at all there are any.
Yes, I think I saw your hand go up first. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to ask you, have you considered, I mean, not considered, you obviously have considered Tagore's personal life and his position in the society at that time, and India's, the position in which India was at the time when he was writing and doing his work. How do you analyze all of it as being a French citizen? Because it must have been difficult for you to understand the culture, to understand what values are here, the conservatism of the Bengali family and stuff like that. So it must have been not very familiar to you. So how did you analyze all of that at once?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I spent a couple of years in India, and in fact, I tried to understand, and I spent a lot of years studying. There was a first MA thesis, and the second MA thesis, like an MPhil, then a PhD, which lasted 4 years, and then it went on and on and on like this. And I don't know, I'm not saying that I know everything about India at that time, but I started specializing on the domain, and so that's one point, which made it possible for me to analyze some things. And then when you read Tagore, you realize that, okay, context is very important, and I've been working on this context to explain many things which were happening at the time, but yet context is important, but not that important, because history is repeating it again and again and again. So what he's talking about is what happens today, or might happen today or tomorrow. So of course, for example, the partition of West Bengal and East Bengal in 1905 is the beginning of a story, and you can consider that this is the setting. But what is more important than the setting is the atmosphere. And of course it's very Bengali what was happening at the time, but I think that any Indian knowing a little bit of what was happening there at the time will know that, okay, it could have happened somewhere else, could have happened in Ukraine and Russia, or something like that. We can all have other examples. Of course, technically it's not true, all right? Everything is a bit different, but we know that what is the core of the text is pretty universal. So context is important. I tried to do my share, or give as much as I could on the domain, so that I could explain to the French readers what was happening at the time. So in this you've got like 3/4 by Tagore, and 1/4 of the book is more my work, trying to give the indications. But then indications, not too much interpretation, because the readers have to do the job.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Couple of things, I think reading Tagore in any shape or form is like a journey. You read him at different ages, you understand something different. You read him in a different time, you understand something different. In India, what is happening today, there are a lot of things, how the nation is understood, or how nationalism is understood, or how women are understood. He has made a lot of different kinds of comments on that, so which I find very relevant to the India of today.
Absolutely.
And I mean, he was a man very, very ahead of his time. He was a human being very ahead of his time. But what I wonder about as a scholar, and my question to you is, how do you think Rabindranath Tagore and his work is relevant to the world today?
Today?
Yes.
Very relevant, because I was reading again 2 of his major essays, which are, or let's say, collection of essays, go back towards universal man, and go back to nationalism, and definitely you could wonder at the end of it whether he was writing this in 1921 or whether it's in 2021. There is no doubt this person made it really, he had it It's a long-term view. He's like the sentinel, he watches over. That doesn't make him a saint, okay? I'm not like idealizing the person as if he was a guru. I'm just saying it's true. What you're saying is that what he wrote is extremely relevant. It's very relevant, yes or not? Relevant. Relevant, yeah.